the attention of the world, and this seminar is focused on the gruesome brutality that we see in many ongoing conflicts, and that is especially devastating for women and for children. This brutality needs to be made known in order for the world to react. At this time, 10 years after 9/11 attack in the World Trade Center, it is inevitable that we also ask ourselves whether that action was a signal of a new wave of contempt for human lives by the perpetrators. And further, did it sadly trigger countermeasures that likewise often showed utter disregard for human lives and dignity? The principles and rules of the Hague and Geneva and Human Rights Conventions of the 19th and 20th centuries marked dramatic humanitarian progress over the customs of war of the preceding centuries. And those of you who have read anything about the Swedish participation in the 30 Years' War will have vivid images of that. Actually, for the 30 Years' War, about 50% of the European population perished, mostly through epidemics. Must we now, in 2011, fear that modern humanitarian law has no longer been seen as relevant by all those who violate them? If so, I think the investigation and prosecution and trial and punishment of violations, war crimes and crimes against humanity, become all the more important to affirm and to assert the rules that we have to mitigate the horrors of armed conflicts. There should be hope that long-term such prosecutions and judgments will reaffirm the demands of modern international community and have a deterrent effect on the potential violators. I stress long term, because short term, I'm not sure we have seen so much of that. International criminal law and the many tribunals mark a step forward to a more civilized international community. But not more than a step, however, because decisive progress is attained only by drastic disarmament and a drastic reduction in the use of armed force and a respect for the UN Charter's ban on the use of armed force except in self-defense. Now, as an introduction to your discussions of the impact of 9/11 on the current conflict, I should like to review the developments of the 90s as a background to your talk, to your discussion. The Cold War ended around 1990 with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and the harvest in terms of disarmament and arms control was breathtaking. During the peak of the Cold War, there had been some 55,000 nuclear warheads in the world. And that number shrank to some 25,000, which we have today, half of it. Still enough to wipe us out many times. Large quantities of uranium and plutonium were blended in the 90s and still are to become fuel for nuclear power reactors. This is what was termed megatons transformed into megawatts. In the Security Council, no veto hindered the authorization of the armed actions that stopped Saddam Hussein's occupation of Kuwait. Progress. A convention prohibiting chemical weapons was concluded, prohibited the use of it, production of it, stockpiling of it, and that led to the destruction of large quantities of chemical weapons. Although in Libya they still had some quantity left of chemical weapons, as we have seen, but they also destroyed quite a lot. The Non-Proliferation Treaty was prolonged early in the 90s without any new deadline. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was adopted in 1996, although it was, has not been ratified by the US and China, and it's not yet in force. Now that, regrettably, in 1996 was the end of the harvest of the détente that came at the end of the Cold War. In the second half of the 90s, the world lost a great opportunity to expand arms control and détente. And why did this promising evolution come to an end in the middle of the 90s? A major reason, I think, was that after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, there evolved a consensus in the US to remain the sole military superpower in the world. They talked about the unilateral moment that was to be prolonged into eternity. And I read in the US National Defense Strategy the following: the end of the Cold War and our capacity to influence global events opened the prospect for a new and peaceful system in the world. Very modest words, but it describes the Pax Americana. As the Warsaw Pact fell apart, its former members were invited to become members of what? Of NATO. It embittered Moscow, and withdrawal from the anti-ballistic missile treaty that followed later during the Bush administration to develop a shield against intercontinental missiles raised fears in Russia and China that at some future time the US might be able to nuke them or anyone else in the world without being deterred by any risk of counterattack. Presently, the target is to have a strike force that can reach any point in the world at any time within an hour, even without nuclear weapons. After 9/11, 2001, the US did not limit itself to punishing Afghanistan for hosting Al-Qaeda, which it could have done, but stayed in the country. And in March 2003, an increasingly militant and military US went to war against Iraq, claiming wrongly that there were still weapons of mass destruction. Officials in the US administration were dismissive of the rules of international law, including the Geneva Convention, said they were outmoded, not very relevant. And the UN's charter as well, charter requirements of Security Council authorizations for armed intervention. It said what you would need, a permission slip to go to foreign countries. Thus, the 9/11 attack was not only in itself a brutal casting aside of civilized norms and a signal of more to come from terrorists, it also triggered a widespread disregard of these norms, these conventions. Torture and extraordinary rendition were routines sanctioned from the highest governmental levels. The leadership thus set the tone. The world was not welcoming a Pax Americana, and at the time of the presidential election in 2008, there was war fatigue, so the pendulum began to swing in another direction. Obama's victory in the 2008 election was partly due to the reactions against the trigger-happy Bush regime, and Obama proceeded without delay to present policies to resume disarmament and dialogue, and to acknowledge the relevance of and validity of international law. His policies were inspired by and supported by arguments launched by a group of US elderly statesmen, George Shultz, Kissinger, Bill Perry, and Sam Nunn. In January of 2007, this group reminded the world that the Cold War was over and voiced the view that nuclear deterrence was obsolete between the US and Russia and obsolescent elsewhere in the world. The biggest threat, in their view, was the spread of nuclear weapons to further states and to terrorists. And they urged the US and Russia to take joint initiative to global disarmament and to start it themselves. Well, Obama and Medvedev met in London early in 2009, and they agreed to open talks on the prolongation of the START agreement. They further supported a broad array of agreements and measures, even the ultimate goal of a total elimination of nuclear weapons, although Mr. Obama said he didn't think it would occur in his lifetime, and the US would not do it unilaterally. On March 1st of March 2010, the new US-Russia START agreement was signed in Prague, exactly 1 year after Obama's speech in Prague. Now that and other events raised hopes for a renewal of the lost détente and for a revival of disarmament. But no. It was only with the greatest difficulty that President Obama could get START approved in the US Senate, and US public support seems still to remain broad for a super strong and super expensive military sector to the tune of about $700 billion. It is calculated that the world's military expenses are around $1,500 billion, and that over 40% of this falls on the US, while 6% falls on China, about which there is a lot of worry expressed, and between 3 and 4% each on the UK, Japan, Germany, and Russia. 6% on China, 4% on Russia, 40% on the US. There is currently political agreement in the US to keep the nuclear weapons sector in top trim. That was one price Mr. Obama had to pay for acceptance of the START agreement. And to construct new submarines, to continue the flow of billions of dollars into the missile field, to put more resources on unpiloted drones, to continue preparation for space war, and efforts to get ready for cyber war. In many other countries, too, there is upgrading of the military sector. China is expanding in the Blue Sea Navy, so does Australia, India, Singapore, not to speak about the oil-rich countries in the Gulf that are worried about Iran and expanding their armed forces and missile defense. Only Europe seems relatively restrained in this. The UK, with some effort, got up over 2% of its budget, of its GDP in military expenditure. This situation is, I think, somewhat puzzling. In the US, on the one hand, resistance to further steps to disarmament and continued expensive military preparation despite a disastrous budgetary deficit. On the other hand, a war fatigue and a wish for disarmament. People want out of Afghanistan and they resisted to be drawn into Libya. How can you explain these contradictory currents in the US and to some extent similar ones in Russia, where you also have security experts who resist disarmament and who want to modernize their military forces? I think that a large part of the US military, industrial and political security elites still does not discount the possibility of armed conflict between the great powers, as the quartet did. They demand that the powder keg be kept dry and updated. In the public the memory of 9/11 is still there, allowing 20% of the federal budget to be for military purposes. Now, Russian security elites watching the US examples urge that the Russian powder keg too be kept dry and updated. In the US, the foreign affairs dominated the security elite, including, I think, President Obama and the quartet, while recognizing the risk of proliferation and terrorism, thinks the risk of nuclear war between the great powers is a thing of the past. So far, the prudent, or perhaps over-prudent, have prevailed in the budgets and planning, as Lena was saying a while ago. It's been more on the weapons, it's less on the civilian assistance. But it's a very expensive prudence, using up to, as I said, 20% of the US federal budget. In my view, only a period of severe controversies free of severe controversies between the great powers will convince the prudent, if I call it a nice word, that after the Cold War and with accelerating globalization, the world is in a new phase. Accelerating globalization may not be an unmitigated blessing, but I'm convinced that it will largely be a factor for peace. It is used to be claimed with dubious validity that MAD, the risk of mutual assured destruction through nuclear weapons, that this was what prevented war. It's a doubtful claim, but that was famous MAD. Today, I would like to use another abbreviation, MED, M-E-D, mutual economic dependence. This, I think, will lead governments to have regard for the interest of fellow states upon which they are dependent, and to exercise moderation so as to avoid escalation of the controversies into armed conflicts. The process of democratization that we have witnessed in Latin America for some time, and now witnessed in the Arab world, has still a long way to go to be sure. There will be more civil wars in the world. Nevertheless, with fewer armed conflicts in the world, renewed respect by leading governments, including the US, for international law and enforcement of humanitarian law, we might hope that the setback